At 9 a.m. on December 31st, 1941, in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz steps onto the dock and begins walking toward the destroyed center of America's Pacific Fleet. He is met by exhausted officers, hurried salutes, and the constant work of cranes lifting wreckage from the water. Nimitz has come to take command, but the first thing he sees is not a fleet ready for war. It is a fleet still trying to survive its own losses. The battleships that once symbolized American sea power lie damaged, sunk, or under repair. The harbor is crowded with wreckage, broken steel, and oil-stained water that has already become part of daily routine. There is no dramatic pause here, no ceremony that matches the scale of the disaster. Nimitz understands immediately that the war has already begun without him, and it has started with the United States behind. His first hours are spent listening to reports that do not offer comfort: damaged infrastructure, missing personnel, limited supplies, and an enemy that has the initiative across the Pacific. The harsh fact is this: America's remaining striking power is not in its battleships anymore. It is in its carriers. And in December 1941, the United States has only a handful available in the Pacific. The most important are Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, but even that number is unstable. Saratoga will soon be torpedoed and forced out for repairs, and the carrier force will become thinner than most Americans would ever realize at the time. In the opening phase of the war, the entire strategic balance can hinge on whether a single flight deck stays afloat. This is the first major decision Nimitz must face, not whether to fight, but how much to risk before America can rebuild. He is not commanding a full-strength force. He is managing scarcity under pressure, with the enemy advancing and the American public demanding action. The Pacific is too large to defend everywhere, and the United States does not yet have enough carriers to strike hard and defend at the same time. Every raid, every patrol, every push forward carries the same hidden cost. If a carrier is lost, the war changes overnight. Nimitz studies maps, shipping routes, fuel limits, and aircraft counts the way a man studies a battlefield with no reserves. He knows the Japanese are moving fast toward the Philippines, toward the Dutch East Indies, toward the sea lanes that feed American allies. He also knows that the U.S. Navy cannot win by being cautious. If the carriers stay back, Japan consolidates power. If the carriers strike too early, they may not come back. In early 1942, Nimitz begins authorizing carrier raids, small blows meant to disrupt Japanese planning and buy time. They are not decisive. They are signals. They remind Japan that the United States still has teeth. But they also expose the fragility of American strength. A carrier raid requires air crews flying long ranges with little margin for error. It requires fuel that cannot be replaced quickly. It requires carriers operating far from safe repair yards. The operational risk is constant, and it is understood at every level, from the admiral's staff to the deck crews preparing aircraft in the dark. What if Chester W. Nimitz had held those carriers back and refused to risk them in early 1942? The operational risk would have been Japan gaining uncontested momentum, capturing more territory, strengthening defenses, and potentially forcing the U.S. into a later fight under even worse conditions. In that scenario, America might still rebuild, but it would rebuild while watching the Pacific slip farther out of reach. Nimitz is not reckless, but he is firm. He understands that time is a weapon, and right now the enemy has more of it. The American carrier force will not win the war in a single battle yet. Its job is to keep the war from being lost before the rebuild arrives. That is the quiet pressure sitting behind every order he signs. As night falls over Pearl Harbor, the work continues: repairs, refits, training flights, and the constant movement of ships preparing to sail with incomplete strength. Nimitz knows the war will soon demand a decision larger than raids, and when that moment comes, the United States may have only 3 carriers to stop an empire that believes it cannot be stopped. A carrier deck crew works at speed as aircraft are secured for a mission no American carrier has ever attempted before. On USS Hornet, sailors lash down bombers that were never designed to launch from a ship at sea. The planes sit crowded and heavy, leaving almost no room for error. The officer in charge of the strike force, Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, knows exactly what this is: a one-time raid meant to prove the United States can still reach Japan. The Doolittle Raid, launched in April 1942, is a tactical gamble with a strategic purpose. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle leads Army B-25 bombers off the Hornet while Enterprise provides protection. The damage in Tokyo will be limited, and American leaders understand that before the first plane even takes off. But the raid is not about destruction. It is about forcing the enemy to reconsider what is safe, and it is about restoring American confidence after months of retreat and loss. At the operational level, the risk is severe. The task force must move deep into the Western Pacific, far from support. If Japanese reconnaissance finds them early, the carriers could be attacked with little warning. If the strike launches too far out, the bombers may not reach land. If it launches too close, the carriers could be caught. When the fleet is spotted ahead of schedule, the decision is made fast. Launch early and accept that the crews may not make it home in one piece. The raid hits Japan and shocks the leadership in Tokyo. It exposes a weakness that has less to do with bomb damage and more to do with certainty. For Japan's top commanders, the question becomes urgent. How do they remove America's carriers from the war before American industry turns them into an unstoppable weapon? That question has been sitting with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto since before Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto is not a man blinded by optimism. He understands American production and American resolve, and he knows Japan cannot fight a long war on equal terms. His solution is to gamble again, but this time on a larger scale. He wants a decisive carrier battle that will destroy what remains of American naval air power in one controlled strike. Yamamoto's plan centers on Midway Atoll. It is a small outpost, but its location matters. If Japan takes it, the threat to Hawaii increases and American defensive lines shift backward. More importantly, Yamamoto believes an attack on Midway will force the U.S. carriers to respond because Nimitz will not allow the atoll to fall without a fight. Yamamoto intends to use that response as bait, drawing American carriers into a trap where Japanese carrier strength can crush them. The plan is complex and spread across a wide area. That complexity is not a detail, it is a strategic vulnerability. Yamamoto divides his forces to cover multiple objectives and to mask his main striking group. He assumes coordination will work across long distances and that American forces will act predictably under pressure. It is a plan built on confidence in timing, secrecy, and the belief that the United States cannot know where the main blow will fall. At sea, Vice Admiral Chūichi Nagumo leads the Japanese carrier striking force. Nagumo is experienced and disciplined, but he operates within a doctrine that expects control. Carrier warfare demands constant judgment under uncertainty, and the farther forces move from known intelligence, the more dangerous that demand becomes. Nagumo's carriers have already proven their power at Pearl Harbor and across the early Pacific offensive. Now he is being asked to finish the job. Back in Hawaii, Nimitz has to interpret the enemy's intention while protecting what little he has. This is where American advantage begins to form, not in numbers, but in information. Naval intelligence has made critical progress breaking Japanese codes, and it gives Nimitz a forecast of where the next major strike will land. It does not provide perfect certainty, but it provides enough to plan an ambush rather than a reaction. This becomes the central leadership test of the early war. Nimitz cannot match Yamamoto ship for ship. He cannot afford to lose a carrier in a guessing game. His only realistic path is to fight where the enemy expects obedience, then deliver surprise instead. If Isoroku Yamamoto had tightened his plan and kept his forces concentrated near Midway, would Nimitz have had any room to maneuver? The operational risk for the United States would have been direct. Fewer gaps to exploit, faster Japanese reinforcement, and a higher chance the American carriers would be detected and overwhelmed before they could strike. In that situation, even a single American mistake could have produced a carrier disaster that the U.S. Navy could not replace quickly. In late May 1942, the pieces start moving. Japanese forces sail east with confidence built on previous victories. American carriers move quietly into position, supported by submarines, patrol aircraft, and a commander willing to stake everything on a narrow chance. Both sides are preparing for a clash that will not be measured in ground gained, but in flight decks lost. The next battle will not be fought for pride. It will be fought for time, for initiative, and for the ability to continue fighting at all. Aviation mechanics on an American carrier work in tight spaces as pilots climb into aircraft that may not return. Engines start, flight decks vibrate, and the air crews move with practiced speed as the first strike groups are sent toward the enemy. Out beyond them, Japanese carriers are already launching their own planes. The battle begins with incomplete information on both sides, and the distance between certainty and disaster is measured in minutes. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz has committed almost everything he can afford: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Yorktown has only recently survived the Battle of the Coral Sea and reached Pearl Harbor damaged. The repair work is rushed but effective, done in days rather than weeks because the U.S. Navy cannot wait. Nimitz understands that this is not a fight for territory alone. It is a fight to keep Japan from controlling the Central Pacific and forcing the United States into a long retreat. The Japanese carrier force is stronger on paper. Vice Admiral Chūichi Nagumo commands 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, and their air groups are among the most experienced in the world. Their first objective is to neutralize Midway's defenses with air attacks. The larger plan, driven by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, is to destroy American carriers when they rush in to respond. Japan believes the U.S. fleet will fight predictably. The Japanese do not expect the Americans to be waiting. On June 4, 1942, the first wave hits Midway. Bombs strike runways, fuel stores, and facilities. Midway's defenders absorb losses and stay in the fight, launching what aircraft they can. Their attacks against Nagumo's carriers are disorganized and costly. Torpedo bombers and patrol planes approach under heavy fire, many of them cut down before reaching effective range. Yet those attacks matter even when they fail, because they force Nagumo to keep maneuvering and keep his combat air patrol busy. Nagumo faces a decision that will define the battle. After the first strike reports Midway still has combat capability, he prepares a second strike to finish the job. His reserve aircraft are armed and rearmed as he tries to balance 2 threats: finishing Midway and preparing for the American carriers he believes are somewhere nearby. The problem is that he never has a clean picture of where the Americans are. His scouting is incomplete, and the reports come late and unclear. Carrier warfare punishes hesitation, but it also punishes commitment to the wrong target. On the American side, confusion spreads as strike groups launch from different carriers with different timing and different headings. Some squadrons miss contact, others attack alone. American torpedo bombers from Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown push forward at low altitude into concentrated Japanese defenses. Many of these crews are killed before they can release their torpedoes effectively. The loss rate is brutal. The attacks do not sink carriers, but they pull Japanese fighters down and keep the Japanese formation in motion, disrupting the timing of everything Nagumo is trying to do. The expert reality is this: Midway is decided not by a single genius plan, but by a chain of decisions and errors under stress. Nimitz takes a calculated risk by placing his carriers where he believes the Japanese will be. Nagumo takes a calculated risk by trying to manage 2 missions at once. Both sides act on imperfect intelligence. The difference is that one side is trying to force a surprise, and the other is trying to restore control that is already slipping. What if Chūichi Nagumo had immediately launched his reserve strike against the American carriers the moment he received the first contact report? The operational risk for the United States would have been immediate and severe. American carriers could have been hit while their own decks were crowded with returning aircraft and refueling operations, causing crippling damage or sinking 1 or more carriers before the dive bombers found the Japanese fleet. In that scenario, even a partial Japanese success might have saved their carrier force and prolonged their dominance in the Pacific. Instead, the battle turns in the space of a few minutes. American dive bombers arrive overhead while Japanese decks are crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed. The timing is decisive. Bombs hit Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu in rapid succession. Fires spread fast, fed by fuel, ammunition, and the fragile density of carrier operations. Damage control struggles, but the ships are mortally wounded. Japan loses 3 fleet carriers in one blow. Hiryu remains operational long enough to strike back. Its aircraft find Yorktown and hit it hard. Yorktown is damaged, then hit again. The crew fights to keep the ship alive, and for a time they succeed. But the effort costs lives and drains strength the Americans cannot easily replace. Later, a Japanese submarine will finish Yorktown with torpedoes, sinking a ship that had been held together by speed, discipline, and urgent repair work. By the end of the day, Hiryu is found and destroyed as well. Japan has lost 4 carriers. The most experienced core of its naval aviation has been broken in a single battle. The United States has lost Yorktown and many air crews, but it has preserved the carrier force that will carry the war forward. Nimitz does not celebrate the way people imagine victory. He has won something more practical than pride. He has won breathing room, time to rebuild, time to attack, and time to keep the next battle from being fought on the enemy's terms. A tired carrier crew works through heat and fatigue as aircraft are rearmed and refueled for another day of operations, even though the war is still short on everything that matters. Planes are repaired with limited parts. Pilots fly with fewer replacements behind them. Commanders read reports knowing that a victory at Midway has not ended Japan's ability to strike. It has only changed the schedule. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz understands what Midway truly bought him: time, not safety. The United States has survived the most dangerous stage of the war, but the Pacific is still a long fight across thousands of miles. Japanese forces still hold vast territory. Their battleships remain powerful. Their land-based air power remains lethal. And now, with their carrier arm damaged, Japan turns toward defensive expansion, fortifying positions that can bleed the Americans for years if the next moves are slow or confused. This is why the months after Midway are filled with urgency rather than relief. Nimitz knows the U.S. Navy cannot simply wait for a perfect fleet to arrive. Waiting would allow Japan to build airfields, strengthen supply lines, and create a layered defense that would cost far more American lives to break later. From a strategic view, the U.S. must keep pressure on Japan before those defenses harden. In the summer of 1942, American intelligence and reconnaissance point toward a developing Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. If completed, it could threaten the supply route between the United States and Australia. It is not a glamorous target, but it is strategically decisive. Nimitz authorizes an invasion that the United States is not fully ready to support because the alternative is worse. The Guadalcanal campaign becomes the next test of American carrier power. There is no excess strength. Every carrier is a critical asset, and every carrier loss risks collapsing the offensive. The battles around the Solomons are not about a single day's outcome. They are about keeping ships, aircraft, and fuel flowing while both sides try to strangle the other's logistics. As the fight intensifies, Admiral William F. Halsey is placed in command of the South Pacific in October 1942. Halsey brings energy and aggressive intent, but he also inherits a situation that cannot be fixed with attitude. His orders must fit the realities of damaged ships, limited air groups, and crews who have been operating at crisis pace for months. The carrier war now demands endurance, not just courage. Japan's commanders attempt to claw back initiative through repeated naval actions around Guadalcanal. Their aim is to isolate the island, starve the American forces, and destroy American naval support before U.S. industry can fully bring new strength forward. For Japan, the Solomons campaign becomes a chance to win by attrition. For the United States, it becomes a struggle to fight effectively while still learning how to run a carrier war under constant threat. American carrier operations in this period are shaped by hard lessons. Aircraft losses are not just tactical setbacks, they are strategic limits. A damaged carrier may survive, but it might be forced out of the fight for weeks. A pilot killed is not easily replaced in months. And the strain on crews, from engine rooms to flight decks, accumulates until mistakes become more likely. This is the human reality behind operational readiness. Fatigue destroys efficiency and judgment long before a ship is sunk. If William F. Halsey had pushed his carrier force into a decisive engagement around Guadalcanal without protecting supply lines, would the campaign have survived the next Japanese counterstroke? The operational risk would have been severe. American ground forces could have been left without air cover and resupply, allowing Japan to regain the airfield and break the invasion. In that situation, the U.S. might have been forced into a costly retreat that delayed the entire Pacific offensive and restored Japanese confidence. Instead, the Americans fight in a pattern of calculated risk, holding the line, striking when possible, and pulling back when survival demands it. This is not a story of constant victories. It is a story of taking losses without losing the mission. It is where the U.S. Navy proves it can keep fighting while building strength at the same time. By late 1942, Guadalcanal becomes a grinding test Japan cannot sustain. Japanese supply runs are disrupted. Air losses mount. Their attempts to retake the island fail, and they begin withdrawing. The Americans hold, but they do not emerge untouched. Ships are sunk. Crews are buried at sea. The war is consuming people faster than the public back home fully understands. When Nimitz looks at the map, he sees what Midway truly meant. The United States is now moving forward, but the margin is still narrow, and one bad week, one carrier lost at the wrong time could still strip away the initiative. A staff officer sorts through carrier strength reports and aircraft replacement numbers, trying to match what commanders want with what the Navy can actually deliver. The work is methodical, unglamorous, and constant. In the Pacific, the war is increasingly decided not only by courage and leadership, but by whether ships, planes, fuel, and trained crews can arrive faster than they can be destroyed. For Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the early carrier crisis becomes a permanent lesson. It forces a style of command that is disciplined and realistic. In 1942, every carrier decision was a wager made under pressure, with no safe backup plan. By 1943, the United States begins bringing new ships into service, and the war shifts into a different kind of struggle, one built on sustained operations, logistics, and industrial strength that Japan cannot match. This is where the moral weight of command becomes harder to see, but no less real. Midway and Guadalcanal proved the U.S. Navy could fight aggressively and survive. But those victories were never free. Every carrier strike required pilots who accepted long odds, deck crews who worked without rest, and damaged ships that stayed on the line because there was no one else to replace them. The public saw headlines and maps. The fleet lived the cost in aircraft losses, burned hangar decks, and men who never came back from the next launch. Nimitz's approach after the crisis reflects something deeper than tactical competence. He learns to treat time, intelligence, and concentration of force as weapons equal to any gun or bomb. He resists the temptation to chase every target. He learns that in a carrier war, the enemy is not just the fleet across the horizon, but the mistakes made in planning, timing, and communication. A single delayed report or misjudged search pattern can cost a ship that takes years to replace. Japan's leadership faces the same kind of arithmetic, but without the same industrial base. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood the danger of a long war, and he had tried to avoid it by winning quickly. Midway failed to deliver that outcome. The loss of Japan's carrier strength at Midway and the drain of Guadalcanal strip away the margin Japan needed for surprise and maneuver. Their fleet can still fight, but it cannot regenerate its elite naval aviators at the pace required. When their most experienced aircrews die, the loss is permanent in a way that steel and fuel never fully replace. Vice Admiral Chūichi Nagumo, blamed by many for Midway, becomes part of a broader truth about war leadership. Carrier battles do not reward perfect planning. They reward commanders who can decide under incomplete information while the battlefield changes minute by minute. Nagumo's hesitation was costly, but it was also a symptom of a larger problem. Japan had built an operational system that assumed control could be restored once disruption began. Midway showed that control could vanish faster than doctrine could adapt. On the American side, commanders like William F. Halsey represent the aggressive will that the war demanded, but even aggression had limits. In 1942, pushing too hard could destroy the carrier force outright. In 1943 and 1944, as more carriers arrived, the U.S. could finally sustain that aggressive style without betting everything on a single ship. That transition, scarcity to strength, is one of the defining changes of the Pacific War. The deeper story behind only 3 carriers is not just a moment of desperation. It is the reason American strategy becomes sharper. Scarcity forces discipline. It punishes waste. It demands intelligence work that narrows uncertainty. It rewards commanders who understand that winning battles is not enough if it destroys the ability to fight the next one. By the later stages of the war, the United States can strike across the Pacific with carrier task forces that would have been unimaginable in early 1942. But that power does not erase the memory of the months when a single torpedo could have broken the war effort. The men who flew off those early decks carried a burden that was rarely spoken aloud. They were not just fighting for victory. They were buying time for their country to become strong enough to finish the war. Nimitz never needed to dramatize that truth. The decisions spoke for themselves. When the United States had almost nothing left to risk, he chose to fight anyway, carefully, but decisively. And because he did, the Pacific War did not end in 1942 with American defeat. It continued until the United States had the means to win it. In the end, the story is not only about ships and admirals, it is about a generation that stayed at sea, kept launching aircraft, kept repairing damage, and kept moving forward when there was no margin left.